Hello, I'm Jesse Martin. Renowned as a painter of princes and the prince of painters, Peter Paul Rubens lived during the 1600s when Europe was torn by war. Rubens' fame allowed him to travel freely through Europe's royal courts. It was the perfect cover for his other life, as a secret agent for the royalty of Spain. He managed the impossible when he brokered a peace agreement between England and Spain. Just like their creator, the two stolen Rubens paintings in this episode of Art, Crimes, and Mysteries also traveled the world, caught in a web of intrigue.
Thank you. As you can see, I'm a huge fan of Law and Order. And for those of you who don't remember Jesse Martin, there are lots of reruns on. And I wanted to dedicate this, I hesitate to call it a lecture because it's really not highbrow enough to be called a lecture, but in the phrase of a former director of the Metropolitan Museum, Thomas Hoving, Walter's son. Remember Hoving's happenings? Well, I like to think of tonight as a Rubens happening. And it begins with the almost perfect crime. Two priceless Rubens oil sketches stolen from a museum in La Coruña, Spain. And here is a photo of La Coruña. It's a seaport on the North Atlantic coast of Spain. It was from La Coruña that the ill-fated Spanish Armada set sail to England, not one of the great triumphs of Spanish naval history, but they can boast, La Coruña, by the way, means the column, and it surely refers to this, the so-called Tower of Hercules, which is the longest operating lighthouse in the world. It's been a lighthouse for 2,000 years since the Emperor Augustus of the Roman Empire. And this seaport town boasts a very nice museum. It was, up until a few decades ago, the capital of the Spanish province of Galicia, which then was moved to Santiago de Compostela. But it had a very nice museum that boasted, among an assortment of Goyas, Velázquez, Van Dycks, two great Rubens oil sketches, painted rather late in his career in 1636 for the Spanish King Philip IV. On the left, Daedalus and the Minotaur, and on the right, Aurora. I think I can show you better slides than these. There is the Daedalus, who was the architect for King Minos of Crete, and there's the Minotaur, half bull, half man, because he was the offspring of Minos's queen, who fell in love with a bull and found satisfaction by dressing herself up in a cow's costume. Well, we don't need to get into all the details. We'll leave that for another night. This is a PG lecture. The other rather lovelier and more innocent oil sketch is Aurora, the goddess of dawn, who holds the little vial of dew in her right hand. Now, well, I think I'm jumping ahead. Let me tell you what happened on a very quiet day, 1985, at the Museo de Bellas Artes, the Museum of Fine Arts, September 16th. There was a man in a dark coat. The museum had very few visitors that day. There were only two on staff, and this was in the 1980s when, before Spain's great economic boom, and these museums were very cash-starved, as I fear many may be these days as well. A man appeared in a dark coat. He looked like another tourist. He had in his pocket a screwdriver, and when no one was looking, He went into the room with the two Rubenses, took the screwdriver, pried the panels, because these are little oil sketches on panel, as you can see, a little very thin piece of wood, pried them out of their frames, tucked them in his trench coat, left the museum, and the theft wasn't noticed until the museum closed at the end of the day, by which time it was too late. It was the nearly perfect crime because there were no fingerprints, no clues, no leads, nothing. Dead silence afterwards. What could the museum do? Well, it reported the loss to the Art Loss Register here in New York, which is a branch of IFAR, the International Fine Arts Research, which is based here in New York. And weeks, months went by, there wasn't a whisper on the black market, and there's always the fear when a picture of some fame is stolen from a museum that it may be destroyed, because it's very hard to sell, even on the black market, pictures that are from public collections and well known. Well, I'd like to, at this point, take a little detour. Well, there's the museum, you know, after the handiwork, so to speak. I'd like to take a brief detour just through the life of Peter Paul Rubens. There is the artist himself, late in life, about the time when he painted these oil sketches. You see he rests his his left hand on the hilt of a sword. He was twice knighted, as our friend from Law and Order pointed out, both by the King of Spain and the King of England. I think the only artist in the history of art to have been knighted by two monarchs. And as a young man, he was, of course, from Flanders. He's Belgian, present-day Belgian, but he went, as so many did, to Italy as a young man. There he sketched the only known record of Leonardo's famous Battle of Anghiari, which was in the Palazzo Vecchio and is now destroyed. We know it only through the Rubens. And then, of course, studied Michelangelo, the Sistine Ceiling. There's a nice drawing of one of the Ignudi from Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling. And he returned to Antwerp and set up a studio and began a very lucrative, famous career. Here was one of his earliest commissions, a triptych for the Cathedral, the raising of the cross. You see, he learned the lessons of Michelangelo in this very heroic, muscular figure of Christ, and there's a horse, could have been out of the Battle of Anghiari. He also turned his brush to mythological subjects, which we'll get to later, because that's the subject of our theft tonight. And this is, of course, Ganymede, which again could have been lifted from the Sistine Ceiling, being borne aloft by Jupiter in the form of an eagle to be cupbearer to the gods. There they are, enjoying their meal in the background. He soon settled down and married Isabella Brandt, and like a good husband, set her up in a very nice house. There it is today. You can visit it in Antwerp. It's now a museum. He built, designed, as a result of his years in Italy, a very Italianate art studio where he employed a host of collaborators, really the finest painters in Antwerp of the day, to help him on his vast projects. There's the inside of his house at the end. He was also a great collector, at the end of which is his own little pantheon, which was a sculpture gallery of antique sculpture. You can see that today as well. There's his garden, art studio. And here, upstairs at the Met, and I was given very strict instructions by my wife, Richie, who is a volunteer for the L-High students, to try to stick to the Met as closely as possible, or I'd hear from her. This is the wolf and fox hunt upstairs, and it's a very good example of Rubens and his studio, because there are many hands at work on this picture. Of course, the design is Rubens, the final touches are Rubens, but he didn't paint every square inch of this picture by any means. He couldn't have. There was just too much of an output. Here, recently at the Met, thanks to our new director, Thomas Campbell, who, God bless him, brought over some of Rubens' finest tapestries for that magnificent show that was at the museum a year ago. This is his Constantine tapestry, and then again, you can see the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. You can see again the lessons of Leonardo, the Battle of Anghiari. And here Rubens would do an oil sketch. It would be blown up, enlarged, and then tapestry weavers would turn it into a tapestry. Here, because yesterday was the Feast of the Epiphany, I can't resist showing my favorite epiphany in the history of art, the visit of the three kings to the manger and the Christ child, complete with these wonderful dromedaries in the background. And on a more personal and, I think, intimate note, one of my favorite double portraits of children of an artist. These are his two sons. He had three children with Isabella Brandt, who sadly died shortly before this picture was painted, and so did the eldest child, who was a daughter. So poor Rubens, at this point in his life, had lost his daughter and his wife, but he painted these two boys. One grew up to be a scholar, as you can already see hinted, and the other one was quite the businessman, and he's got the little bird on the string. I just love this picture. What did he do? During these years of widowhood, he served the governess of the Spanish Netherlands. She was the princess, the daughter of King Philip II. She was the aunt of the current king of Spain, the King Philip IV, and it was then known as the Spanish Netherlands. Today it's Belgium. And she sought peace between England and Spain, which was at war, and had no better diplomat. I mean, really the Henry Kissinger of his day in Peter Paul Rubens, who, because he was this world-famous artist, could travel from court to court freely, painting portraits, executing commissions. And here for the Queen Mother of France, Maria de Medici, he did the famous Medici cycle, which I see now is in its new, rather ultra-modern setting. It's overwhelming, as you can see. I mean, some people just, it's I don't know if they'd allow this sort of thing in the Met, but, you know, this is France. But in the Met, upstairs, we have an oil sketch for what was to be the next cycle devoted to her husband, Henry IV, who said Paris was worth a mass. And there he is, the triumph of Henry IV, alla Romana, as though a Roman emperor being led in triumph, a magnificent oil sketch. This is 100% Rubens. Here you see all of Rubens' own brushwork, of course, greatly enlarged. It's a very small picture, but it's upstairs to be enjoyed and admired. Later on in life, after he successfully negotiated an exchange of ambassadors, for which he was knighted by both King Charles I of England and Philip IV of Spain, he finally decided his international traveling days had come to an end. He wanted to return to Antwerp. He settled down and married a relation of his first wife, the young Isabella Brandt was the first wife. This is the young Helena Formont. I say young. He was, at the time they got married, 53. She was 16. And they had 5 children. This is painted toward the end of his life. This is the youngest boy, little Peter Paul. And this picture was probably finished the last year of his life. His 5th child was born 9 months after he died. So he remained active right up to the end. And here, again, going back upstairs on family orders, you see a visitor studying out of sight the label for this, one of Rubens' great mythologies from this period of the 1630s, which is going to be the subject of our art heist tonight. And it is, here's a better view of it. It's, of course, the famous Venus reluctantly parting with Adonis, who's going to go off to hunt, and a wild boar, which will kill him. So Venus has a premonition of this. She's very upset. Cupid, her son, clings to him, trying to hold him back. The arrow is at her feet because it was because of one of Cupid's arrows grazing her foot that she fell in love with the mortal Adonis. And of course, it ended in tragedy. But this is really the perfect, I think, intro to our series now from the mid-1630s, where Rubens undertook his greatest, in terms of numbers of paintings, commission for Philip IV of Spain. It was for his hunting lodge outside of Madrid, the so-called Torre de la Parada, and he wanted literally wall-to-wall Rubenses, over 60 Rubens paintings, for which Rubens had to employ virtually every talented painter in Antwerp to work up his oil sketches. Here is one of them, lovely oil sketch, again one of romance, and like the Venus and Adonis, I should have added, based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, the tales of the loves of the gods. And this is Bacchus and Ariadne, and for those of you who are opera lovers, all you have to do is think of the beautiful music of Richard Strauss in Ariadne auf Naxos as you look at this exquisite oil sketch. Here, illustrating a nice biblical saying, pride goeth before the fall. This is Daedalus, the architect of King Minos, who, like Leonardo, invented wings by which he could fly. He equipped his son Icarus with a pair, but Icarus thought he could go higher and higher and higher, and of course, as he got too close to the sun, the wax melted, and he fell to his death. And this is the first perfect, I think, segue into the first of our stolen paintings, because here is Daedalus as the architect, and in a happier moment, with, you see his architectural tools, showing the maze at the end of which the great monster, half bull, half man, the Minotaur, was going to live and devour Athenian youths who were sacrificed to him until he was finally killed by, who was it? Theseus, I think. There's a close-up. You can see the Minotaur, looking rather admiringly at his new palace. And here is the Aurora with this wonderful glow, the goddess of dawn, with her vial of dew, which, of course, is her job to sprinkle every morning when the sun rises. There's a nice detail of her face, and the drapery, her hand, and there she is again. Now, there was not a word, as I said, complete silence for several months, 4 months, I think, until in December, I think it was, January, I'm sorry, of 1986, that in Stockholm, hundreds of miles north of La Coruña, in the winter, when the days are darkest and dawn breaks late, there appeared a glimmer of light. Now, the National Museum, which you see here, holds once a week kind of an open house where people can bring in their pictures and have them evaluated by the director of research, wonderful woman named Ural Cavalli Björkman. And this day in January of 1986, a local Swedish artist named Harold Luth brought in what seemed to be, to Ural, she was used to seeing things that turned out to be either copies or fakes, but he brought in this picture of this Rubens sketch. And at first she assumed it was a copy, but as she looked at it, she thought it seemed so fresh, so spontaneous, that she asked to keep it for a while. She was very busy, so she had to put it in a cabinet in her office, and there it sat for a week, and she meant to research it. But a week later, she got a call from Harold Luth, from the man who had brought it in. He said he had brought it in on behalf of a friend who owned it, and he called up and said that his friend now wanted it back because he intended to sell it, and he'd be right over. Well, Ural now panicked because she really hadn't done her research, and she pulled off her shelf Professor Julius Hell's great 2-volume work on Rubens' oil sketches. And if there is any hero, and of course the name Held means in German hero, he is the hero of tonight's story, and I am happy to dedicate this to him and to acknowledge and honor him as the man who taught me everything I learned about Rubens, and who also was the professor for Hilde Lamongen, who was responsible for many, many years for these marvelous concerts and lectures here at the Met. So both Hilde and I shared Julius Held as a mentor and teacher, for which we are both very grateful. Well, anyway, Ural had the good sense to pull Held's oil sketches off the shelf, which I call the Rubens Bible, and there she found the same subject and started comparing it with the picture she had in her cabinet. Now, copies always betray themselves. There's always something a copyist misunderstands, misinterprets, gets wrong. But she noticed that every line corresponded to the illustration in Held's book. Every highlight, every detail fell right into place. And then she looked at the credit line and saw that it was from a museum in Spain, in a place she hadn't heard of, La Coruña. So she called the curator at the Prado and was quickly informed that, yes, indeed, that picture had been stolen several months earlier. So now she was panicked. Harold Lutt was going to come in and claim the picture. She called the museum attorney. He said that under Swedish law, the museum had no right to hold on to it, couldn't keep it in custody. She called the police, but there was nothing to be done. It had to be returned to the man who had brought it in. But then, of course, once he took it away, she called the police again and got in touch with a detective, Klaus Triptych. This was his first art case. He was used to thefts and murders and, you know, nice usual crimes like that. But this was his first art case. And what did he do? Well, he called in Harold Lutt, the Swedish painter, and found out that now all of a sudden the friend for which he had served to this errand was simply an acquaintance of his wife's. He was, in fact, a transplanted Spaniard living in Sweden by the name of Ramon Ramudo. So next, Ramon Ramudo was called in, and he turned out to be very cool, poker-faced. After several questions, he finally reluctantly admitted that, yes, indeed, he did own this picture, but he claimed it wasn't real. It was a copy. It wasn't an original. And besides, he no longer had it. He had given it to a local art dealer, the Gallery Morgan in Stockholm, to send abroad to be appraised and to be sold. They had sent it to Sotheby's in London, which in turn forwarded it to Sotheby's right here in New York. Now, this was a huge problem for the Swedish police because it was now out of Swedish jurisdiction. So what was to be done? Well, they contacted Sotheby's in New York, and I'm happy to say Sotheby's responded immediately with honor, returned the picture without question to the National Museum in Stockholm, where it remained now in safe hands. Ramon, when questioned, it turned out that what was his livelihood? How did he come to own this picture? Well, we'll go back a little bit. He had most unlikely jobs. He was a chauffeur part-time, and the rest of the time he worked for a friend's and in-laws office cleaning company called the Coyote Cleaning Company. And he said that he wanted the picture back. It was his picture, even though it wasn't an original, because he had paid $30,000 for it and had bought it from two fellow office cleaners, two students from South America, one of whom had studied, they were art students, one of whom had studied in Leningrad and wanted the money to fund the communist guerrilla movement in South America. I mean, you can't make up this stuff. Well, I mean, he made it up, but I wouldn't have had the nerve to make it up. Well, anyway, there was now enough evidence to warrant a search warrant. They raided his apartment early in the morning. They found lots and lots of second-rate art, some of it by Ramon Ramudo himself. Alas, no Aurora. The other oil sketch was not to be found. But they did find his passport, and they noticed that he had been in Spain the week after the theft of the 2 oil sketches. All the evidence pointed to Ramon Ramudo, but unfortunately, it was all circumstantial. And the Swedish prosecutor, Hans Kolb, realized that the best he could do would be to prosecute a safer case. He wasn't going to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ramon had stolen the painting, but he could charge him with trafficking in stolen art, possessing a stolen painting and trying to sell it. So that is what he was tried for. On January 12, 1987, in the Stockholm District Court, the case opened. Ramon pleaded not guilty, not surprisingly, and his defense was that the painting was not an original. It was a copy. Therefore, no crime had been committed. There was no theft. He was entitled to keep the painting. If it wasn't the original, it wasn't stolen. According to the prosecutor, Kolb, he was a very convincing witness under cross-examination, very cool. They couldn't shake him, even with all the inconsistencies of his testimony, like the fact that the 2 students that apparently he had bought it from, there was no trace of them. The police never were able to locate them. When asked, the source of the funds, where does an office cleaner get $30,000? He said, well, if it was through his brother who had a connection with a Spanish bank. And they checked the Spanish bank, and the bank had never heard of Ramon Ramudo. And the Swedish court, despite the coolness of this defendant, they found him guilty. With apologies to Nancy Mitford, I'm inclined to title this chapter of the story, Law in a Cold Climate. But it doesn't end there, because Ramon doesn't give up that easily. 4 weeks later, he appeals the verdict to the Court of Appeals, and now he's accompanied by Sweden's best and most expensive lawyer. You might ask how an office cleaner and chauffeur gets Sweden's best and most expensive lawyer, but some questions just must remain unanswered. But the lawyer was quite brilliant. He argued that the painting that Ramon had and that was in custody could not be the original stolen picture because it differed, you can see it here, by 1/2 of a centimeter, 5 millimeters. And from the dimensions published in the museum's catalog. Obviously, they didn't have the original to compare it with because this was the original, but from the published illustration, there was a 1/2 centimeter difference. And on this splinter of evidence, the guilty verdict was overturned. Not guilty. And worse, the painting now, legally, belonged to Ramon, and the police would have to return it to him. Well, as you can imagine, the prosecutor, Kolb, and Ural Cavelli-Björklund at the museum were utterly appalled because they knew full well wooden panels change size according to humidity and temperature and climate. You can think of the creaking boards in an old house. Think of the cracks in an antique piece of furniture you might have, that the cracks open up in the dry winter months of steam heat, and they close up in the moist months of summer. As wood is like a sponge, it expands with moisture and contracts with dryness. And of course, when we think of where this painting went from, it went from the coast of Spain to the winter in Stockholm. This is no surprise. Well, what were they going to do? They appealed it to Sweden's highest court. 7 months later, the Supreme Court of Sweden heard the case, and of course the prosecutor Kolb was now desperate, but Ural had an utterly brilliant idea. She photographed the painting in custody, made a transparency of it. Then, in the illustration in Professor Held's book, she photographed that and made a negative of the published illustration. And then on the witness stand in the Supreme Court, she put the one over the other, slid it over the other. Now you can see it beginning to slide, and look what happens when it's finally in place. Every line, every shadow, there isn't a gap anywhere. It is, unlike O.J.'s glove, a perfect fit. And the proper verdict followed. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. But God bless the Swedes. They're such a tolerant, benevolent people. They have this oddity in their law that if you're the first-time offender, if you're the first-time convict, they give you 6 months to put your affairs in order before you report to prison. Well, needless to say, our friend Ramon Ramudo did not need 6 months to hop on the next plane out of the country, carrying, no doubt, the Aurora in his knapsack. And they lost all trace of him. He's now an Interpol fugitive. There was some indication that he might have flown to Spain and then Japan and then South America, but at that point they lost all track of him. And nothing more was heard. Now we fast forward. I give you half good news. Of course, the one oil sketch was returned to La Coruña, but there's the other half of the story we have yet to fill in, literally. But 1991, a continent away, April 25th, U.S. Customs in Miami gets a call from what's known as a CI, a confidential informant. Now, he's not a government employee. He's somebody who kind of teeters on both sides of the law. Well, look, here we go. Here's Miami Beach in a happier day, 1967, where you see Frank Sinatra and Jill St. John enjoying a little respite outside the Fontainebleau Hotel. I wish I could tell you that that my adventure took place in such glamorous surroundings, but no, not quite. But at least it gives you a feeling of the place. Well, anyway, this confidential informant, his name was Stan, or that's the name he went by. He called Special Agent Dave D'Amato at Customs headquarters and said that he had heard that there was a woman who had a smuggled Rubens painting called the Aurora for sale on Miami Beach. Now, Dave D'Amato had a lot of experience in narcotics smuggling and the like, but he was brand new to the fraud squad. Still, if you're a special agent in customs, the word smuggled is a very important word, and all sorts of bells and lights go off. And so they did some quick research, and they found out that the woman was named, who was offering this painting, was named Orly Bagel. And I do encourage you to Google her. It's Orlibeigel. Now, she had no police record. She'd arrived recently in Miami. They found out through whatever it is, passport control data. She had dual Mexican-Israeli citizenship. And her main career was, interestingly enough, promoting performing artists, mainly classical artists, in Mexico. Now, when I, a couple of years ago, learned how to Google, I couldn't resist Googling her. And I found, to my amazement, that among the artists she represented in Mexico was our own beloved Frederica von Stade, who has performed many times here at the Metropolitan Museum. So it is a small world. But needless to say, Flicka had nothing to do with the stolen Rubens. By the way, Orly Bagel also claimed to stand the undercover, or the confidential informant, that she was a descendant of the family that invented the bagel. That was that was about as true as, well, I also Googled the origin of the bagel, and I promise you Orly had nothing to do with it. Well, anyway, the painting was called the Aurora. So Dave D'Amato, who was new to, had never taken part in a art crime before, he called the Art Loss Register that keeps track of stolen art here in New York. As I say, it's a division of IFAR, and asked if they had any record of a Rubens picture that had been stolen called Aurora. They looked it up and they said, no, there's nothing here. There's no record of a stolen Aurora. But the woman who was in charge at the time of this research, Anna Kisluk, she had the bright idea of realizing that titles are often misleading. Paintings often go under different titles, and artists don't, generally speaking, don't put titles on their works. The titles come later. So in this day of pre-computer organization, databases, what have you, she actually did the grudge work of going through hundreds of issues of the Art Loss Register, month by month, year by year, until she found, back in 1986, a painting that seemed to fit the description called Dawn, which, of course, is the English word for aurora. And that's how it was listed. So now they knew they were on the right track. And now, to U.S. Customs in Miami, Rubens was not a household word. It's fair to say that most of the special agents not only couldn't spell his name, but didn't really understand the difference between Rubens and a Rubens sandwich, any more than Orly bagel and a bagel. But Dave D'Amato was a real pro, and I mean, he's one of my great heroes. And he assembled a team and recruited an older, portly, out-of-shape agent named Hank Blair, who may be a relative of ours. I have a brother Blair, and we are descended from the Blair family, but I don't know how distantly related Hank is. But anyway, he was to be my partner. He went undercover, and using the name Thomas, Hank Thomas, and he met with Orly, and he'd had lots of undercover experience in narcotics, but nothing in art. But his job was to play a representative for a would-be buyer, an interested buyer. So the next day, Hank met with Orly in the lobby of the Ocean Grand Hotel. Note, you know it's grand because it has an E on the end of it. And I'll give you another couple of, these are pictures that I took on a revisit to the scene of the crime, so to speak. Where's the next one? There's the backside, where the swimming pool, this is not the Fontainebleau, sorry to say, but she said she felt comfortable there, and one can only wonder about the nature of the ownership of this hotel. There's the swimming pool, and the lobby where they met is on the other side of the Coke machine. Well, after Orly arrived, a few minutes later, two Latins from Central or South America arrived, one carrying a briefcase, and out of which appeared the Aurora. Hank said nothing. He was a pro. He just took as many mental notes as he could, and when he got back to the office, he described what he had seen as, quote, a painting on a thin piece of wood of a fat lady sitting on a cloud holding a light in her hand. Now, to be fair to Hank, it's not a totally inaccurate description. But I think it's a bit unfair. It's a bit cruel because in Rubens' day, she would have been considered a true beauty. It's only in our sort of post-Audrey Hepburn era that a woman of such curves would be considered a fat lady. I mean, this was the ideal beauty in the 17th century. Although, having said that, I do warn you all from personal experience, don't ever compliment a woman and say, "You are so beautiful, you're right out of a Rubens." You'll get your face slapped. Well, the next matter was fixing the price. Orley said she wanted $3.5 million for the painting. Hank's response was, "Fine, no problem." It's very easy to agree to a price when you know you're not going to have to pay it. Dave then enlisted a really cool agent. I mean, he was my favorite of all. He was also the youngest, a guy named Zach Mann. And he had a background, well, he was kind of a James Bond type. He piloted his own boat in narcotic smuggling interceptions. And he did have a background in some art because he had worked on some pre-Columbian art smuggling cases. He took up the research angle, went to the University of Miami Library, identified himself as a customs special agent, asked for the Rubens book, and God bless him, where did he go? Right to Julius Hell's Rubens oil sketches. And he found the picture of Aurora. He took the book out, took it back, showed it to Hank Blair, who said, "Yep, that's her." And then, I mean, these agents really knew how to do their job. It was published by the Princeton University Press, which is a story I won't get into, but it's one of my personal sources of joy and pride that actually I served as Hell's unofficial agent, and out of my single-minded loyalty to Princeton, wanted Princeton's press to publish the book. And it did publish the book, and so the agents got in touch with the Princeton University Press, which in turn gave them the author, Julius Hell's, address and telephone number in Old Bennington, Vermont. Well, he was now in his early 80s, but they contacted him, and he was very helpful. He gave, both Hank Blair and Dave D'Amato talked to him, and he gave them some pointers as to what to look for. Namely, and this is out of the illustration in his book, it's a little faint, but you can see on the bottom of the picture 284, which was the museum's inventory number for the picture. He said, look for that number next time you go see the picture. Well, as you can see, the number's not there. But then they wanted very much to have an expert go down and authenticate the picture before they made the arrest, and they brought in the guns blazing and so forth, for the very simple reason that if it wasn't the real picture, there was no crime, and they would be taking all this risk and spending the taxpayers' money and going through this operation for naught. Well, he said that in his 80s, living in Old Bennington, Vermont, that he really wasn't up to a trip to Miami Beach, and he suggested a sub, an understudy, if you will. And as a result of that, gave me the greatest Walter Mitty adventure of my lifetime. Meanwhile, but we'll get to that in a second. Meanwhile, Orley was getting a little nervous. She thought this whole thing was going a bit too smoothly, and she asked Hank if he was FBI, and Stan, the informer, reassured her and said, no, look, Orley, I mean, is the FBI going to hire somebody who's this out of shape and old? And so he put her at ease. Anyway, there was the next meeting at which Hank Blair said that he had an expert ready to come down, but he needed to verify some things first. And both Held and I had talked to him on the phone. When I got the phone call from Dave D'Amato, my first reaction was, oh my God, did I fail to declare the pearls I bought in Bermuda for Richie? Are they on to me? I was so relieved when it was a stolen Rubens and not something I had done. Anyway, he had this meeting, and Held had given him some things to look for, and I had given him some things to look for. And one of them was, of course, this number, and it wasn't there. And so he asked what happened, why there was no number. And the younger of the two Latinos left the room, called the owner, and got back and said, oh, well, I spoke to the owner, and he explained, and I think you can probably see it if I have the pointer here. You can probably make out, you see it almost looks like there's a bit of an erasure here. And the owner explained that he had erased the number because he did not want the picture traced to him. But he thought that the number was 285. Now that's very telling because 285 was the number of the Daedalus and the Minotaur. So it was proof that the owner of this picture, whoever he was, knew of both pictures and was responsible. You can guess who he was. I mean, this is hardly Agatha Christie. But that was a very telling admission that he got the number wrong and that he said it was 285 instead of 284. Now, you know, in the words of Liza Doolittle, late in My Fair Lady, don't say another word, show me. So at this point, I'd like to stop being a talking head and cut to the BBC documentary and show you the denouement, what happened once we hit Miami Beach. And then I'll just give you the follow-up at the end. So I guess we can dim these lights and, as they say, on with the show.
The Miami Customs Police were planning a takedown operation to seize the Aurora, one of 2 Rubens paintings stolen from a Spanish museum 6 years earlier. U.S. Customs agent Dave D'Amato urgently needed an expert to come to Miami to authenticate it. But Professor Hell, who had been helping with the investigation, was too old and frail to travel. He suggested his former student, New York book publisher and Rubens biographer, Charles Scribner.
I was very surprised when I got the call, when I said, well, all right, I'd be happy to do it, but I can't do it on the weekend. And he was quite insistent that the criminals involved were getting a little bit nervous, were on edge, and he wasn't sure that he could hold them over. And I said, well, could you hold them till Monday morning? I will take the earliest flight down, a 6 o'clock flight. That was agreed upon. I went home and announced to my wife and older son, Charlie, that this was the most exciting chance I'd been given to do an armed undercover operation in Miami Beach 2 weeks before my 40th birthday, and that this was just a lifetime's dream. And I thought that my son at least would be excited and share my enthusiasm. He was horrified. He went crying to his mother that I was an idiot. My wife was furious at me, but I told her I had given my word that I would do it, and I had to do it. And secretly, I really looked forward to it.
When Charles Scribner arrived at Customs headquarters, the operational briefing was already in progress.
We brought him into our office. We had several agents, about 10 or 12 agents present. I explained to the agents who were going to be involved in the arrests that Charles Scribner was an expert and that he would be going in this third meeting with us to look at the painting. He'd obviously never taken part in anything like this before, working with a group of armed federal agents and making arrests and so forth. So he was quite nervous.
It was like going to a first-class seminar at a university, and the only moment during this that I was given some pause was when they talked about bulletproof vests, and I naively asked if I would be given one too, and I was told, oh no, we can't give you one, it would look too bulky and it would give you away.
Undercover operations are fraught with danger.
The agents had my full attention at that point, especially when one mentioned that during some past similar buy-bust operation that something had gone awry and there'd been some shooting taking place in one of the lobbies of a Miami Beach hotel.
Uh-oh.
It was crucial that Charles didn't jeopardize the takedown by saying too much.
My briefing was very specific. I was not to say anything. I was simply to go in as the art advisor and simply look at the picture and then simply indicate whether I thought this was the original Rubens or not.
We had the undercover agent prepared to go in with the informant and with Charles Scribner. We had an undercover taxi parked out front. Agent Mann and another agent were monitoring the conversation from that taxi. We had agents positioned around the hotel, in front, on the sides, and in back, which was on the beach side of the hotel. So we had it covered by about 10 or 12 agents.
When we got out of the car, I think Hank was perhaps worried that I might appear very nervous and apprehensive. And to loosen me up, he said, "You know, Charlie, since you're going to die anyway, you won't mind if we use you as a shield, will you?" And I started laughing, and I said, "You know, Hank, I'm not sure I want to be 40 anyway."
On entering the hotel, Stanley, the informer, held back, while Hank and Charles greeted Orly and her associates. Hank was again carrying a concealed camera in his briefcase. Outside the hotel, a dozen hidden agents had the meeting under close surveillance.
There was nobody else in sight. No U.S. special agents seen anywhere around the building or even as passers-by. There was simply one solitary sunbather out by this pool at the rear of the lobby.
But there was a new danger. Orly was now with 3 men, the 2 Latinos as expected, and another unknown man.
This fourth person was a surprise to us. Orly had made mention that she would have someone accompany the undercover agent to the bank to retrieve the money, and the word she used was for security. So we were concerned that possibly there might be firearms involved. Anytime security is mentioned, it usually goes hand in hand with firearm.
At last, Charles was handed the picture.
I was given a manila envelope, and I opened it, and sure enough, there was the Rubens oil sketch inside, wrapped in this kind of greasy red cloth. It was the most unexpected way to discover a Rubens. The casualness with which this picture had been packed appalled me. I couldn't believe I was holding at least $500,000 worth of art in my hands and it had been so poorly wrapped. And I've completely at that point forgot my direction that I was to say nothing. And I turned to Orly Bagel and said, "You know, this is no way to wrap a Rubens. The next time you have a picture like this, you must take much better care of it."
Agent Maxey and I were sitting there kind of thinking, I don't think this was part of the plan.
Charles wasn't sticking to the script. The more he said, the greater the risk that he would slip up and give himself and the undercover agent away. If the suspects were armed, this could be lethal.
I had this picture to myself, or at least to myself and to the criminals and the U.S. Customs special agents. And I decided to give a little seminar on Rubens, and we discussed the identification of the figure. Was she Aurora, or was she, as some scholars had speculated, the personification of the soul, Psyche, in which case what she was holding would not be a little vial of dew, but rather a lamp, the light of the soul. And I could see their eyes were beginning to glaze over a little bit like the painting itself, and I thought Hank was going to pass out at one point because this was the last thing he expected.
We got a little concerned because when you go in with a plan and things start to change and you don't know what's going to happen after that, and you're outside listening in, it can be a little nerve-wracking.
The agents had recruited a loose cannon. Was Charles going to blow their carefully planned operation? Were the men with Orly carrying weapons? Would Charles and the Aurora get caught in the crossfire? Miami, 1991. U.S. Customs Police were at a crucial point in their undercover sting. They were moments away from recovering a stolen Rubens painting, the Aurora. But the agents were anxious that the art expert brought in to authenticate the picture, Charles Scribner, was about to blow their cover. Although he had been instructed to say nothing, he wouldn't stop talking.
I felt it was important to do what any Rubens scholar coming down from New York naturally would do when holding such a picture, and that is be enthusiastic and enjoy the moment. At one point, though, I decided I would have a little fun. And I turned to Orly Bagel and I said, you know, this is the most beautiful Rubens oil sketch I have ever seen outside of a museum. Where did you get it? Well, I thought Agent Thomas would faint at that point. She had the most magnificent answer. It was classic, one word. She said, inheritance. And I chuckled to myself and I thought, that is a great classic answer.
The undercover agent took Mr. Scribner to the side and asked him how sure he was that we had a real Rubens in front of us.
He asked me several times, well, are you absolutely sure? And I said, yes. And he said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you? And I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's an 11. And then he asked a third time. And I finally said, you know, I have 2 sons, and I sometimes wonder where they came from. But I have no doubt where this picture came from.
At last, the police had confirmation that the painting was genuine. The next hurdle was to get Charles out of harm's way. Stanley, the informer, came to escort him out of the hotel.
And then one of the 3 men, the burliest of the 3, made it clear that he was going with me outside the hotel. And that was the first time I ever had any real fear or unease. My immediate reaction was that he suspected something was foul and I was going to be his hostage. But by the time we reached the entrance door to the hotel, this man miraculously vanished. And as soon as I saw the taxi and saw Zach in the driver's seat, I felt I was home free. I had made it.
With Charles safely out of the building, the agents could move in.
Police! Get on the ground! Get on the ground now! Get down! Get down now!
But where was the 4th suspect? The man who had followed Charles and Stanley out of the lobby.
The undercover agent advised us that this 4th individual had disappeared. He gave a description to us, and we started searching the area for him.
I noticed that the bathroom door was open, and I could see someone's elbow move just ever so slightly.
Police! Hit the ground! Hit the ground now! Back!
Searched his bag, and we found a semi-automatic handgun.
Charles only found out later why this man had followed him and then hidden in the bathroom.
What had happened was he and Stan had known each other. As soon as Stan came in to pick me up, they made eye contact. Stan was apparently very surprised to see him there and must have registered his concern and surprise in his eyes, at which point this man took the message and thought, I've got to get out of here, something bad's about to happen. So that it wasn't that I was to be his hostage, it turned out that he thought of me as his escape route.
The suspects were taken to customs headquarters for processing. For the first time, the agents discovered who the 3 men really were.
Okay, I guess
Pablo
we can cut
Alvarez
there.
and his father Roberto and Michael Dimitrov. Orly Bagel, the front woman, came clean about her involvement. She explained how she was pulled into the scam by Roberto Alvarez. He had his own import-export business in Nicaragua, but she didn't know who was behind the plan to sell the painting. Roberto refused to talk. His son, Pablo, was more cooperative.
Well, brief epilogue, and I'll make it very brief. When the confidential agent Stan got me out, he was not happy having me in the car with him waiting for my pickup by a U.S. Customs agent to take me back to the airport. And I could sense his unease, and I said, look, Stan, I said, I'm from New York. I'm used to walking around the streets. Just leave me out here on Collins Avenue, and I'll wait for my ride. I'll recognize her. So I stood right opposite the entrance of the hotel while the takedown was taking place, and I didn't know whether these people sitting at a cafe were good guys or bad guys, so I decided to play innocent, and I said, does anybody know what's going on over here? Because all these guns were drawn, and and they said, oh, drug bust, drug bust. And I said, oh, well, that's reassuring. I'm glad it's nothing worse than that. So my ride came. We went past South Beach, got to the airport, but I got there 2 hours before my scheduled flight, and I didn't want to hang around the Miami airport. I had a government-issued ticket, and I thought, okay, let's see what I can do. So there was an earlier flight. The gate had closed. The flight was about to take off. The passengers were all on board. I rushed up to the gate, showed them my government ticket, and I said, the government wants me back in New York immediately. Whereupon they said, oh, no problem. They opened the gate they opened the door to the plane. They said, find a seat anywhere. So I found the one empty seat, and could you believe I was sitting right in the middle of the Swedish tennis team. It just doesn't get much better. A year later, and I won't belabor this, but a year later there was sort of a second act, which was the trial, and I was called by the prosecutor, Orlando Prescott, who's now a judge, about my testimony. It was to be very pro forma. I was just to testify about what was going to happen. I went back to Miami, had a nice reunion with Zach Mann and Dave D'Amato. I got to the courthouse, and once I was in there before entering the courtroom, I was told, big problem. The curator from Spain had flown over to identify the picture, but our government, in its infinite thrift and wisdom, had decided they didn't need the curator because the defense was stipulating that they weren't going to question the authenticity of the painting. It wasn't an issue. So they, instead of putting the poor curator up for the night, they put him on the next plane back to Madrid. I got there and they said, big problem. The defense found a loophole. They are withdrawing their stipulation. They are now claiming, it's Sweden all over again, that the painting is a fake. It's not the original. There's no crime. There was no smuggling. So they said, you have to convince the jury that this is the stolen picture. Well, I won't go through all the details of it, but I will say this, that the federal judge asked the best question of all. He said, on what, and this is really about connoisseurship, on what basis, what is the methodology? How are you so sure that this is the original Rubens? And I looked at the jury, and again, I thought, Rubens sandwich, they don't know the difference. Don't get technical, keep it very simple. And I said, Your Honor, I said, it is exactly the same as I would know or you would know when a stack of mail comes in the morning. In the middle of the stack, there's a letter from your mother. And I said, before you open the envelope, before you look at the return address, you just look at the envelope and you say, oh, I got a letter from my mother. How? You recognize the handwriting. And I said, it's as simple as that. I recognize Rubens' handwriting. And I looked at the jury and they all nodded. And the good news was by the time the summation came up, the defense withdrew its argument that it might not be the original. They accepted the fact. They said, look, we know it's the original. End of story. The Orly Bagel had turned state's evidence. She was given a probation. The other two, the Alvarez father and son, were sentenced to 18 months in prison. Needless to say, I have not followed up on them. And the only other thing I would add is there was the court. There is justice served. And the only thing I would say is, you know, I'm not advocating stealing pictures from museums. Don't get me wrong. But in this case, I think the best thing that happened to the museum in La Coruña was this theft. Why? Because of the publicity and the successful recovery of the pictures, the authorities decided to build a brand new state-of-the-art museum. Oh, before this, the picture, of course, was returned. These are just family snapshots. I revisited the scene of the crime in 1994 with my elder son, who had thought I was an idiot. We went back to the scene of the crime. There's my younger son, who's now at Georgetown. The Ocean Grand Hotel still stood. There was where we, how do we get the next picture? There's where the meeting took place. Of course, Chris has more interesting things to do than listen to his father talk about the art theft. And La Coruña built this absolutely exquisite new glass and steel museum of fine art. And there are the two Rubenses side by side under a very watchful eye. The only unanswered question is whether Ramon Ramudo, who I might add, I think I failed to mention, they had discovered that as a young boy he lived in La Coruña. The museum was on a direct line, 5 minutes from his house to his school. He would have passed that museum every day on the way to school as a young boy. And the only question that I can't help asking myself is, will he resist? He's still at large, he's still an Interpol fugitive, maybe in Nicaragua, maybe someplace else. Will he resist the opportunity before the end of his life to return to his hometown and see the two pictures he once owned? Stay tuned. Thank you.